Hello and welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. I'm your host, Michael Washington. We have a very fascinating program today. Our program is the first of a series that we're going to be having discussions on regarding Africa. Our title today of our program is Slavery in Africa and America. Our guest is Dr. Jonathan Reynolds. Hi, Dr. Reynolds.
Hello there, Dr. Washington.
Before we talk about the topic, let's get a little background on who you are and what gives you the right and the honor, I might suggest, to talk about this topic, slavery in Africa and America. Most people would think that since you're an Africanist, African historian, that perhaps you're different from what we expect in the sense that you look more European. Give us some background.
Well, that's right. Well, as I often say to my students, I'm a middle-class Southern white guy who wound up doing African history all the same. It started out actually when I was an undergraduate at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I was one of those unusual students who in high school actually paid attention in my history classes. And so when I went to the University of Tennessee and was taking the required European history survey and the required American history survey, it was all material I'd seen before. And I decided at that time if I really wanted to do something new historically, then I needed to start learning about the rest of the world. So I actually did Asian history first, then I did Latin American history, but it was the survey of African history that really changed at how I looked at the world. It was information that you never hear unless you have a really exceptional history teacher in high school, and certainly coming out of public schools in the South, this was not the sort of information I'd been introduced to. So from there on out, next thing I knew, I had a PhD in African history from Boston University, and I was teaching African history for a living.
And why do you think African history was such a captivating idea for you? Was it the difference, or was it the history itself? What was it that you thought more fascinating about African history, say, than European, or because there's a lot of European history in African history.
Oh, well, that's certainly true, and I have to say, in defense of all history, I find all history interesting. I enjoy teaching world history as well as African history. But what initially captivated me was the difference. It was the fact that African history was a history that I was completely unfamiliar with, and also that the reality of African history was so different from the mythology of African history. You know, you grew up in the United States, what sort of images of Africa are you going to have? You know, I often say I grew up on the cusp of the two great images of Africa that exist in the United States. You grew up with the Tarzan image. You know, when I was a kid, you'd see dialing for dollars. You know, every day when you came home from school, it'd be, you know, Tarzan and the lost city of gold. And Africa was a big jungle, and there were hardly any Africans, and if there were, they were always running away from the one white guy, Tarzan. And then, of course, by the time I got to college, you had the Live Aid image of Africa, where Africa was one giant desert, and there was the people there were all starving. And that, you know, what was your job as a white person? It was to take part in this giant party that was somehow going to save Africa from starvation. And so the image of Africa you see in an African history class is very different. In some ways it stresses the similarities to European history. There were empires, there were kingdoms, there were kings, there were queens, there was an economy that spanned the breadth of the continent. And all of that is so surprising when you've grown up with these Tarzan-like images that it just absolutely drew me in.
We'll do another series, and we'll specifically call it Images of Africa after the series on slavery. So we'll come back and talk about those images, even the images of the Islamic empires and so forth. But going back to the whole concept of slavery now, slavery was an institution in Africa long before even the Western Hemisphere was discovered by the Europeans. But our image of slavery is not at all what the Africans were doing. Would that be fair to say?
I think that is very safe to say. It's very important when anyone approaches the topic of slavery, to keep in mind that throughout the broad scope of human history and human societies, that slavery has been almost a constant. It's much more unusual to find a society that doesn't have slavery than it is to find one that does have slavery. But that doesn't mean that all slaveries are the same. And certainly Americans have a very particular image of slavery as a result of our own history. And to project that image of slavery outside what slavery might have been in other parts of the world at different times is very historically dangerous.
But would you say that when we use the word slavery, we have certain images that come to our mind that in reality, historically speaking, are really not the image of slavery at all, but really the image that we see slavery as because of the Negro slave experience in America?
That's right. Slavery in other parts of the world doesn't necessarily mean race. It wasn't necessarily based upon one race enslaving another. It could very well have been one ethnicity enslaving another, or one class enslaving.
Was it ever perpetual, for instance?
That's another key component that makes slavery in the New World, not just in North America, but throughout the Americas, very different in that it was an inherited status. That's something you typically don't find in other societies that have slavery.
Well, can you give us some more characteristics of the New World, as we call it, slavery,
okay.
the Western Hemisphere slavery?
One thing that's very important to do is also to recognize that within the academic community, there's very much of a debate over the use of the word slave itself. I was actually in a very interesting discussion with a colleague just this past week as to whether or not it's safe to use the word slave, because there's very much a tension that exists within a slave-owning society between the slave owners who want to create this identity of slave, to define someone else as a slave, and those people who are themselves enslaved who want to keep their own identity as people who have the potential to be free. And so many academics nowadays insist on using the term enslaved persons, which twists the perspective. When you say a slave, you're actually looking at someone from the perspective of a slave owner. But when you say enslaved person, you're looking at it much more the perspective of someone who is fighting against this attempt to restrain them.
That's a very interesting point. Oftentimes, I don't think that debate makes mainstream in terms of historians, because you still see the concept of slave equated with the concept of African American.
Yes, absolutely.
So you see the slave culture, slave society. Who are you talking about? The Egyptian slaves? You know, who are you talking about? So I think that debate needs to get more mainstreamed, and perhaps over the next few years.
Well, that's certainly one reason why programs like this are so important, because academics have such a tendency to just talk to one another, and at least even if we're two academics here speaking with one another, we have a wider audience. And that's, I think, very much one of our obligations, is to get these ideas out and also get feedback from the wider community.
But here's a book, for instance, called Bullwhip Days. And in this book, it suggests the slaves remembered. The slaves remembered. These the slaves of Greece, the slaves of Rome, an oral history. And it's edited by James Millen. But this is the image that we tend to have. When you say slaves remembered, you tend to think African American people. What you're saying to us is that to be a slave, historically speaking, in the larger scope, people were not necessarily just African.
Indeed. In fact, that's where the European or the English term for slave comes from. It actually comes to the word Slav, is that prior to slavery in the New World, many of the slaves in Western Europe actually came from the East and were defined as Slavs.
What about African slavery? Are you saying to me that Africans had an institution as part of their cultural, institutional, structural arrangement called slavery?
Yes, indeed. I am willing to say that. But again, and this is a point where the academic debate comes forward, is that many African historians, many African specialists are uncomfortable using the term slave in the context of Africa. You'll often see an entire book on the issue that will use quotation marks around the slave, all around the word slave, all the way through, just showing how uncomfortable they are with the term, which in the ideas of many readers defines slavery in the context of how we understand it in the New World.
Are you talking about African historians? Because in the books that I see, they seem to be very comfortable with using the word slave and slavery as it relates to Africa. In fact, I've even seen books that implicate that even the Africans owned slaves, hence it was okay for the Americans to do it to the Africans.
Indeed, and this is one of the key reasons why an understanding of slavery, both in the New World and in Africa, is so important, because one of the key things which Americans, particularly white Americans, seize upon is the idea that if there was slavery in Africa, then somehow slavery in the New World was justified. And this is, when you are a white African historian, it's not at all uncommon to have people kind of sidle up to you, usually at a cocktail party. And they'll come up to you with that one question. They'll say, well, wasn't it true that Africans had slaves? And you'll say, yes, and that's all they want to hear. And they'll make their escape right at that point. And then you have to grab them by the lapel and kind of drag them back and say, but. And that's when you have to go into the point that slavery in Africa was very rarely the sort of thing you would see in the New World.
Well, would it be unethical to answer such a question? No, they did not?
I think it would. And
in the sense of how you're thinking? Go ahead.
Well, I think the key here is how you define slave or enslaved person. And the idea that there's somehow some element of status which defines a person as a slave or an enslaved person, whatever your terminology may be. And I think the key point here is that a slave is someone who has had their choice denied to them. A slave is someone who cannot choose where they live. A slave is someone who cannot choose what kind of labor they do. A slave is someone who cannot choose what their future is going to be.
But in Africa, why, they had a future. Each individual who was enslaved could have had a choice at a certain point.
Well, at a certain point, you may be able to say that in that...
Except the fifth category is those who were criminals.
Yes, and once we get to the various stages of slavery within the Ashanti society, I think that will be more clear. But the key is that if you were enslaved in Africa, at least for possibly your lifetime, very likely, if not your own children's lifetime, your choices were laid out for you. Now, one of the key differences for Africa is that there were many sort of outs, many sort of avenues by which a person could escape the institution of slavery. But even those weren't chosen for them. By marrying into the slave-owning family, for example, you would be free, but you still don't have that choice of, say, going home, which is that critical element. I don't want to live with you. I don't want to work in this field. I would like to return to my own home, my own family, my own culture. Even in the context of Africa, that wasn't an available option.
Well, let's talk about Africa. You mentioned the 5 slave stages, and let's talk specifically about the Ashanti people.
Okay.
And because I guess, and if we talk about the Ashanti people, this is merely one ethnic group of people whose experience is very typical of how slavery perhaps was throughout the African continent, even though they may not have known other people, say in Southern Africa or Eastern Africa, but it's very typical.
And this is one of the great challenges of doing African history, at least as the field stands in the United States right now. While it's very common to have at a university or a college, you'll have several people who do American history. You have several people who do European history. It's inevitable that if you have someone doing African history, it's just one person. And that one person is going to cover all of African history through all of time. And this is an incredibly daunting prospect.
Now you're a professor here at our institution.
Absolutely right.
What are you doing, young man? Are you trying to jam our department here?
No, I want to compliment the history department at Northern Kentucky University of having the foresight to hire an African historian. Whether or not it was me, it was a good idea.
Well, thank you.
But I do have to say that also I look forward in the decades that come, as Northern Kentucky grows and expands in its mission, it makes absolutely as much sense to have several African historians as it does to have several American historians. It's impossible for one person to cover all of the continent of Africa through all time. I mean, we're talking about the continent of the world that has had the longest human habitation and hence has the most history. And there's so much work left to be done in African history. That just means we need more African historians.
Well, that's a very diplomatic response, and I really appreciate that. And that's part of my argument that always has been.
Well, we hope that some administrators are watching.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But to come back to the point of comparing slavery in Africa, because Africa is such a huge continent. It's 4 times the size of the continental United States. Because it has such a range of cultures, it's impossible to speak of slavery as an African institution because there's so many variations. The choice of using the Ashanti as a case study has several advantages. One is that the Ashanti are a group very familiar to Americans. Almost all Americans have heard of the Ashanti, at least in some context. They're familiar with the idea of kente cloth, which is very popular in North America. Many have heard of the golden stool, which is the sign of authority, which is the symbol of kingship amongst the Ashanti. Also, the Ashanti were very much involved with the transatlantic slave trade. They were one of the few African states that actually profited greatly from the slave trade. They were a major source. They were one of the major groups that captured other Africans and sold them off into the transatlantic slave trade. So they're very much tied up in this whole issue of slavery in Africa and slavery.
And that's the other, hold on to your point, but that's the other argument that those people who would stop you at the party would say, didn't the Africans participate? Didn't they sell their own to the Europeans? And you're saying that the Ashanti were big people,
That's right. That's right. Now, the Ashanti were already a fairly powerful state even before the real advent of the transatlantic slave trade. But they were definitely one of the groups who saw either that this was something that they could benefit from, as a means of gaining access to Western trade goods, Western capital, and in particular firearms, or they saw it as something which they had no choice in. And this is one of the key sort of catch-22s of the transatlantic slave trade. Even if an African state didn't want to take part, there was always the danger that if any one of your neighbors took part in the transatlantic slave trade, they would then gain this technological advantage, mainly through firearms, which were one of the key goods traded for slaves, that if you took a higher moral ground and said, well, we don't want to participate in this, this is immoral, then you were almost certainly to be one of those people who fell prey to the transatlantic slave trade. A good case in this, actually, is the state of Dahomey, which is just to the east of Ashanti. Dahomey took part in the transatlantic slave trade for a number of decades, and then as soon as they had established enough power and had gained enough firearms to defend themselves, dropped out and said, we don't want to take part in this anymore. And it wasn't until they were once again threatened from outside that they returned to the transatlantic slave trade. So many Africanists see it, the transatlantic slave trade was a competition or a game that you couldn't help but take part in.
But how does slavery manifest itself with the Ashanti people prior to the transatlantic?
Right.
How did they do it institutionally?
Well, it's interesting in that, again, since there's been this constant sort of attempt on the part of many European historians to use African slavery as an excuse for slavery in the New World, you see there are actually a whole variety of levels of servitude, which we might call it, in Ashanti that at one time or another were all translated as slave by Europeans. But I think now at this point, maybe we can go through those sort of 5 levels of servitude.
Now, would they themselves call these levels of servitude slavery? Or did they look at these as distinctly different situations that people found themselves in? But we call it slavery.
Exactly. From our perspective, and again, in America, we tend to see things very much in terms of yes, no, or black and white. Rather, here you have very much sort of subtle shadings of servitude. The most basic one of these was what was known as a koa.
A koa.
A koa, and these are all in Akan or Ashanti or Twi, which are the main languages spoken in the region. But the status of a koa is someone who would be obliged to provide labor to a social superior on call. So, say, taking you, for example, that you are an associate professor, you're tenured, I'm a lowly assistant professor, and Dr. Washington calls me and says, Dr. Reynolds, as an assistant professor, it would be a good thing for you to come and do a video presentation with me. This would be very much what the Ashanti might see as an ACOA
Are you
relationship.
accusing me of putting you into slavery, young man?
No, actually, I think that's the part-time lecturers who are most guilty of that.
We only have about 5 minutes left, so just keep that in mind as we go through. But let me just pose this question. How would a person become an ACOA?
An ACOA would probably simply be someone who had accepted some kind of service from their social superior at one time or another. So if they had accepted a loan, or if they had been granted land.
I could pay off my debt by putting myself into servitude.
Exactly.
Almost like indentured servitude.
Yes,
in the
except
European sense.
it's even less controlled than that. This labor would probably be, I would be called in to assist with the harvest, for example. Or I may be called in to deliver a message across town or something. And this is much more what we see in the context of the United States or European history as a patron-client relationship. You have power, you have wealth, and I am subordinate to you, and I will help you out in return for access to capital from you to your largesse at one time or another.
We got 4 more stages to go through.
That's right, and
only 5 more minutes.
That's right. The next stage is what's known as awoa, and this is frequently what is defined in the literature on African studies as pawnship. Let's say if there's a family which has a substantial debt to someone else, for a large quantity of land or a substantial cash loan, maybe to start up a business or something like this, the family would actually loan a child, very frequently a young female, but not always, a teenager possibly. And this child would go and live with the family of whoever had provided the loan. And that child will do whatever that family asks them to in terms of labor, help out around the house. They might be apprenticed to that family to learn a trade.
7 years or so?
Until the debt is considered to be paid off. And so this could be something which would last several years, or it could be something which would last several months. But again, this has a finite end to it. It's something that's going to end. And a key point is that if the two families intermarry through this, then the debt is immediately forgiven. Okay. So again, this is something which could last for several years, but also has a finite end to it. Okay. It's an important point to say here that the awoa, the pawn, doesn't have a choice as to whether or not they're involved in this. It's a choice made by the family, but it's still something which has an end. The next stage of this is something which...
Stage 3.
Stage 3 is called adonko.
Adonko.
And this is someone who is non-Ashanti, that is, they're coming from outside this wider Akan-speaking language group, who has been purchased. And so this is, again, much more familiar to somebody in the American context. They have been purchased for some kind of goods or simply a cash payment. This person's status is indefinite. It could easily last their entire lifetime. And they can be asked to perform just about any kind of labor. They can work in the household, they can work in the fields, they might even be involved in a sort of plantation-style labor.
How would they be sold? Who would sell them into another, to the Ashanti?
They would actually be sold by slave traders.
By African slave traders?
By African slave traders, indeed. These people could be war captives, although that's the more common next status, known as domun. But these are folks who have come from outside. Indeed, many of the surrounding ethnic groups to the Ashanti paid tribute to the Ashanti state in the form of slaves. But again, one of the key differences here is that if an odonko is married into the family, or in the case of a female, if she becomes pregnant by anyone in the owning family, that person must be freed and become part of the family.
Now, wait a minute. You're saying if that person becomes pregnant, they will be freed?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, now, in the United States system of enslavement, the masters would impregnate the women to make their children property. In fact, they made it a law in about 1662 to say that they had access to the African women's bodies to create perpetual slavery. And you're saying that in this system...
And this is one of the key differences in the context of Africa, is that slavery is almost never an inherited status, and quite to the contrary, any time you become part of the family of the slave owners, you must cease to be a slave. And so
that's a very big difference.
It's a very big difference. You're still dealing with someone who's been forcibly taken away from their own family, from their own culture, but at least in this situation, they are offered an out, and they, most importantly, perhaps also, they knew their children would not be slaves.
They knew their children would not be slaves versus on this side of the Atlantic, they knew their children would be slaves, even if they were the master's children. That's how the whole mulatto class, in a sense, was created because of that. And that's a very, very interesting phenomenon. You got two more stages.
Two more. The next one is known as Domoon. These were war captives. Who had been captured in a conflict between the Ashanti state and some other group. They could also be sold. This was a common source of slaves to be sold into the transatlantic slave trade as well. But if you were sold into Ashanti society, you could be put to work again in any kind of labor. Domoon frequently found themselves working in the Ashanti gold mines, for example. But here again, if you were in the sort of situation where you could be married, if you were married into any family, you had to be freed. And also, if you had children, they too would be free. So this is also, the status of Domoon was frequently permanent for an individual.
Does being freed mean you would become actually a citizen of that state?
You would become a member. It was actually, it's difficult for non-Ashanti to become citizens within Ashanti society, but you ceased to have that status of slave. You were a free person and could pursue your own economic and family life within the sort of wider Ashanti society.
1 minute left and one more status.
Okay, the final status is known as akere, which means very specifically people with no rights. And this is much more what we associate with slavery in the New World, because that's what it meant to be a slave in the early United States or in the Caribbean. You were a person with no rights at all. A kere could only gain such a state through some sort of extreme transgression, a commission of treason against the Ashanti state, a commission of heresy against the religious system, murder, or something along these lines.
A criminal-minded individual.
Absolutely. And this, you might think of being an akere as the sort of equivalent of capital punishment amongst the Ashanti. Once you became an akere, you had absolutely no rights whatsoever. You were not allowed to have children at this state. So you didn't worry about your children inheriting your status because you couldn't. And akere were very frequently also sold into the transatlantic slave trade.
So in most of these situations, the people were not seriously beat or brutalized. They did not, their children did not inherit the status of enslavement. So we're talking about fundamentally different kinds of institutions, aren't we?
Indeed. Now, there's still a brutality here involved, that you're removing people from a situation in which they wish to be. They're removing people from their own
But it was
culture.
a more humane relationship.
A less brutal.
Less brutal, not more humane.
And again, people had a concept that this was not a permanent status, if not for themselves, certainly not for their children. And there's a very, very important proverb spoken by the Ashanti here, which says, never ask another person of their history, which means that there may be slaves in your family, amongst your ancestors, but this is not the business of anyone else in the society to ask of you. That is all in the past.
Okay, and that's a wonderful proverb to end this particular segment. We're going to pick back up and have another one on the images of Africa. Our time has just run out. Thank you for the brilliant, absolute,
my pleasure.
magnified presentation on slavery. We'll continue this discussion. Thank you for tuning in. This has been Afrocentricity, Slavery in Africa and America. Until next time, this is Michael Washington. So long.